What's up, Colorado Realtors? I'm Scott Peterson. Thank you for joining me for another edition of Legal Bites. It's nice to be back in the studio. I did one a couple of months ago in the studio, but my friend Monica and I, who produces all these things, we've been shaking out the cobwebs, cleaning things up in here, and clearing out the dust from almost a year of non-use. And still been doing a few Legal Bites from my home office. But hopefully we're now going to get back into the studio for this stuff and talk about everything other than COVID, which is what I think we're all looking forward to talking about. So here we are talking about another hot market topic. I think the last Legal Bites I did was talking a little bit about the appraisal gap clauses. I want to talk a little bit about the inspection insanity that is going on out there. Inspection waivers, all kinds of inspection waivers, and in my mind, inspection insanity. Now, I know what you're going to think. You're going to think, Scott, of course we know as buyers agents how crazy this is and how stupid it is of our buyers to be waiving inspections in order to write competitive, sexy offers that will hopefully be accepted by sellers because there's no inspection contingency, correct? And so you don't need to hear that. You buyers agents already know that. It's nuts. It makes no sense that a buyer would ever allow themselves to purchase a property without performing an inspection. And so you're going to say, well, this is not even a Legal Bites that I need to watch. Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking to you buyers agents about it because I'm going to focus a little bit more on the insanity that I believe in that occurs when a seller allows a buyer to not perform an inspection. So buyers' implications, we understand. We understand why they should care, but I get it, they don't, and they're willing to do crazy, crazy things in order to get their offers accepted. But let's think about it from the seller's side. When a seller allows a buyer to waive their inspection contingencies and not inspect a property, that is, I think, almost as insane as a buyer agreeing to buy a property without doing an inspection, maybe even more so in some cases. Why do you think that is? Well, that is because when a buyer doesn't perform an inspection, 100% of their lens on the property flows through the seller's property disclosure. So if your seller is going to be allowing a buyer to not perform an inspection and waive their inspection contingencies, that seller's property disclosure needs to be so thorough and complete that it details every nick and knack and nook and cranny on the property, because the buyer's not having an opportunity to inspect because they've waived it. Well, now that seller's property disclosure becomes as much information as they really have about the property as a buyer receives about a property. And so unlike in a normal situation where there's going to be an opportunity to inspect themselves, to bring in professional inspectors, engineers, anybody else that might need to consult with the buyer on condition of the property, the buyer is 100% now relying on the seller and the seller's property disclosure for any adverse material facts, any property condition information about the property. That seems insane to me, unless, again, the seller wants to sit down and go through every corner and crack in their house and be putting that in writing as a disclosure to the buyer who is not going to be performing an inspection. So think about the implications of that. I know some sellers think that it's somehow attractive to accept an offer because a buyer doesn't have an inspection contingency. But in my mind, that's just setting that seller up for potential lawsuits post-closing for failure to disclose things that would have easily been uncovered and seen by a buyer in performing their own inspection and engaging their own qualified inspector to actually consult with them on things like the water heater and the HVAC system and the roof and the cracks in the wall and the potential structural issues that may exist, whatever the issues are. So be thinking about that as you're working with sellers and sellers are considering allowing a buyer to waive their inspection contingencies. What do? Well, you could still, as a listing agent, require that a buyer inspect or give them an opportunity to inspect, but just remove the dates and deadlines for the inspection, all right? So all of those 10.3 deadlines, inspection, inspection objection, inspection resolution, inspection termination, those could all be in A, but then if I was a listing broker, if I was a seller, I would be requiring some additional provision that specifically provides the buyer with the opportunity to inspect. Because remember, when you knock out those paragraph 10 conditions, that is the buyer's entire right to inspect is embedded in 10.3. And if it's gone, the buyer doesn't have a right to inspect. So create that right to inspect, I suppose, in the additional provisions. Encourage the buyer to inspect. Now, if the buyer finds something, if they want to terminate, I suppose they don't have that right, so they're going to be essentially walking away from their earnest money at that point. But better that, I suppose, than closing, identifying a whole bunch of issues that were not disclosed through the seller's property disclosure in writing, and then trying to file a lawsuit against the seller for failure to disclose all of these things that otherwise would have been easily uncovered with an inspection. So be thinking about that. There's two sides to this whole concept of inspection waivers, and I think it's risky business for both the buyer, for obvious reasons, but for the seller, for reasons that hopefully I've cleared up a little bit here today. Have a great one. We will see you on another edition of Legal Bites. If you ever have questions, you can always utilize the Car Legal Hotline. That's available Monday through Friday, 9 to 12 and 1 to 4, and love talking to you on that as well. Take care, guys. We'll see you on the next edition of Legal Bites.